We acknowledge God in faith as the source of life and the creator of all things. But what do we make of our experience of death and what it means and how we remain connected to a God who is the source of life and the creator of all? And all of our readings, even though our middle one does not deal with the experience of death, speak of the transforming power of God's love and say to us that yes, there is a love of God that can come to us when our world is turned upside down. God's love can reach us even then. Our first reading tells of the ancient prophet Elijah. He was a servant of God who lived in the 9th century BC. And in the story that unfolds in the first book of Kings and what follows, we learn that he is in a sense the last faithful servant of God standing. He served God during the reign of the infamous king and queen duo Ahab and Jezebel, who had led the kingdom of Israel away from their covenant relationship with God to the service of the fertility gods who were called the Baals, the Canaanite fertility gods. Elijah was the last man standing, the last faithful servant of God. And God protects him. In the story that unfolds, it's intentional that he looks like a kind of pathetic figure. It looks like, God's covenant relationship is just about all washed up. But yet the power of God works through Elijah. He is a mediator of God's fidelity, not only to the people of Israel, but to all people. Now, how about this for an image to support the life of the church? God sends the prophet Elijah to sponge off a starving widow and her terminally ill child. How's that to move your heart? This is how the story unfolds. God sends Elijah to a widow of Zarephath. Zarephath was in ancient Phoenicia, present-day Lebanon, to a Gentile and pagan place because the Israelites would not welcome God's presence among them, had turned away. So God sends the last prophet standing to a foreign people, and he says, "Go to the widow of Zarephath, she will take care of you." This is the state of Elijah. He will be cared for by a starving widow who is caring for her own sick son. And in the gospel, Jesus does something that in the custom of the people and even in our own day would be considered awkward and inappropriate, to say the least. He interrupts a funeral procession, tells a grieving mother not to weep, starts touching things, the funeral bier, with the man's body. There are ways in which all of us, I'm sure in some way, have experienced the reality of death, our own mortality, maybe in your own family's lives, the lives of family and friends. You may have been a part of a funeral procession from a church to a cemetery. We know how these work. The cars line up in the parking lot. The funeral home people are attending. They give each driver a little sign to hang from the rearview mirror, a little magnet flag to put on the roof of the car. Everyone is told, turn your lights on and your flashers, and we'll go in procession. The hearse carrying the body leads the way and negotiates through traffic. People in the procession expect from their neighbors driving a certain respect, that the procession won't be interrupted. But it can happen that someone who happens to be driving comes to an intersection and sees a funeral procession coming along I confess, yes, I'm guilty of this. And I come along, and you come along and say, oh no, a funeral procession. How can I beat this? How can I get through that? Am I going to have to wait this whole time? I'll squeeze right through. And if you're in the procession and you see this going on, you sort of become indignant behind, what is he doing? Has he no respect? And this would have been going on as Jesus approached this woman and the funeral procession. Who is this guy? What is he doing? Do not weep. Does he have no respect? The transforming power of God's love can come into our lives in ways that we don't expect, that take us by surprise, can even seem in a way inappropriate. But this is how Jesus worked, and this is what happened in the home of the widow, where this strange man has come to live and eat what little food they have. He becomes a mediator of God's power to bring new life. And the life breath is restored to the widow of Zarephath's son. And the widow's son in Nain is told, arise. It's understandable that we focus our attention on the dead who are returned to life. That tends to be an attention getter. But the real focus in those two readings is not on those who were dead and came to life, but it's on the living and how they come to experience that God has been with them all the time, that God is faithful even in the experience of death and loss, which is a part of life that we can't avoid. But how do we trust that God is present to us? How do we have faith and hope in our Lord's triumph over death? You know, there's a saying that I came across. I found it when I was preparing for a funeral mass, and I've used it frequently, and I think of it even when I'm not involved in a funeral mass, and I don't always use it at every funeral mass I do. It comes from a man named Norman Cousins. Norman Cousins was a 20th century figure in the United States. He figured prominently in the early 1960s when tensions were high between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. He became a kind of unofficial ambassador and helped broker the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. For that, he was invited to have a private audience with Pope John the 23rd, who gave him a personal token of recognition of the good that he had done. That's just who the guy happened to be. But he said this. He said, death is not the greatest tragedy in life. The greatest tragedy is what dies inside us while we live. What dies inside us while we live. Elijah restores the life breath, the presence of God's Spirit, to the widow's son. But what about the widow's life breath? That's what was at stake in the reading, and it was at stake in the gospel too. The life breath of the widow, the Spirit of God's presence within her. And it's also an issue for St. Paul in the second reading. St. Paul gives an account of himself in the letter to the Galatians. He said, you know my history. This community that I'm trying to build up, the Christian community, there was a time when I was trying to tear it apart. I was a persecutor of Christians. But that changed. Now for St. Paul, it was not a matter of sort of gradually sort of waking up, well, you know, maybe I should give this Christianity a second look, maybe. He was dead set against it. But he met Jesus, he encountered the Lord, and he changed. Something very powerfully changed, for He went from being a persecutor to being a missionary, apostle, and proclaimer of the good news of God's love in Jesus Christ. Death is not the greatest tragedy in life. The greatest tragedy is what dies inside us while we live. And we celebrate this Eucharist to receive the life of Jesus Christ in the bread and wine that are transformed in our presence, and we are called in faith to believe, become the body and blood, the living presence of Christ for us, so that the life breath of God's Spirit can thrive in our lives. And so that we, when the opportunity presents itself for us, can in some way be a mediator of God's presence to someone who may be suffering, experiencing loss. This is a part of life. We can't get away from it. But what do we make of it? How do we live? May this celebration of the Eucharist strengthen our journey of faith and help us to trust in the transforming power of God's love in Jesus Christ.